Hey, in this video, I'm going to talk about 3 different ways to use personal rituals for your well-being, so stay tuned. Welcome to Wellness with John. I'm John Peters, and these are resources to help you thrive. So, in today's video, I'm going to talk about 3 different ways to use personal rituals to enhance your well-being. Now, I know this might not immediately make sense. What does it mean to do a ritual? What is a personal ritual? How could it possibly help my well-being? But I'm going to explain that. So let's start off by talking about just what ritual is, no matter what kind of ritual we're talking about. And for most people, you may not have actually thought about how to get creative with crafting your own personal rituals. Because for most people, what we do is we just rely on what we call received rituals, the received understanding and knowledge and wisdom of culture. And for most people, that means, civil rituals like weddings or religious rituals, which could include weddings, but things like going to mass. So there are things that we do that we can call rituals, and I'll explain what a ritual is here in a second. But we don't necessarily think, well, this is some way that I can work with how I'm surfing the challenges or transformations in my own life. But in fact, it can be extremely helpful to work with ritual in order to, have optimal well-being. Okay. So let's talk for a second about what ritual is. Ritual is anything that we do individually or collectively that is going to mark out, to note, or to affect some sort of change. Okay, let me give you some examples for this to make sense. So if you've ever had a kid in a karate class, or you took a karate class and you go to the so-called dojo, which is actually usually a rented space in a strip mall somewhere, the teacher might have you be formal in some ways, like might have you call the person sensei instead of teacher. But what they often have students do is when you get to your karate class and you get to the front door where you're going to walk into the practice space, you stop and you bow, and then you take a step across the space. And some instructors have the people do the reverse when they leave class, to go stand backwards at the door, bow, and then take a step backwards across the threshold of the door. Okay, that's an example of a ritual. It's an action that you take that has some sort of meaning to affect some sort of change. And what is the change that happens in that case? Well, what you're doing is you're orienting yourself toward a serious attitude of practice, maybe. You are also invoking sacred space. So when you bow, you're kind of mentally creating this idea that it's not a rented space in a strip mall, but it's a temple or, sacred place to practice that's special in some way. So the ritual is the bow. The thing that it's marking is whatever is special, and you're actually invoking that specialness when you enact the ritual, okay? Similar to genuflecting at the pew when you're going to enter the pew, and let's say, if you're going to Catholic Mass, or similar to elements of civil rituals like throwing rice on the heads of the newlyweds when they get married, and so it's this action that you take that is an element of either a single action or a series of actions that makes something special in some particular way and enact something that's of value or importance to you. So like with a wedding ritual, you have these elements of the ritual, and the culmination of that is everybody decides that the couple is married, right? So that's a very important distinction in terms of status, not married and then married. Well, how do we go from not married to married? We have these definite elements of the ritual that we include in the ritual. And at some point, we give it to them. We say, okay, we've done the ritual and now you're married. Okay. And for a lot of people, that does have personal meaning. Obviously, for some people, it's just performative or enjoyable, and you're just doing it because it's traditional. But, there are a lot of people out there, maybe you included, who would say, if you just go to the courthouse and you do the legal paper to legally be married, you're not really married. You're not really married until you do the ritual, okay? And so the ritual has to happen. It has to include certain elements. And obviously, there's lots of variation, like with the wedding ritual, in terms of what elements people might think are the important ones to include and the ones that are just fluff and extra. But basically, if the ritual actually means something, let's say a wedding ritual, for you to actually decide that it happened and the couple is now married, then one question is, what elements need to be there that we can't take out of the ritual for the ritual to actually have the effect that we want it to have, right? We can't strip it down too much, because once we remove too many of the elements that our way of making meaning says have to be there, then we lose it, right? So again, like if it gets too vague and nebulous, does it really happen? Like if you're a Catholic and you go to Easter Mass and you show up and the priest says, I got this inspiration last night and I'm going to throw out our traditional Easter Mass format that we normally do, and I'm going to enact the Mass today all through interpretive dance. You might not like that, right? The parishioners might revolt. They might question the priest's faculties at that point. And one of the reasons that the parishioners might be dissatisfied with the priest at that Easter Mass is interpretive dance is too vague. It's too frou-frou. It's not the elements of the ritual that we want to exist in the ritual for it to have personal meaning, right? So again, if you look around at civil rituals that aren't religious, if you look at family rituals, if you look at religious rituals, rituals have certain elements. They have certain features. There's certain parts of them that make the thing meaningful, and they make them meaningful because they do the thing that we want it to do, like singing happy birthday at a person's birthday celebration, okay? That's a type of ritual, right? Someone might think, well, my friends got together and we had dinner, but nobody gave me a gift. Nobody sang happy birthday. So it wasn't really a birthday for me, So there are these things that we do that become either a personal or a local family or friend group, social convention, or things that are long-standing conventions within long traditions, both civil and religious. There are things that we do that are called rituals because basically any action or set of actions that has meaningful elements that causes a certain transformation to happen or invokes and brings into presence some quality or some important thing that we value, right? So that's what ritual is, okay? So why am I talking about ritual? Well, my own interest in ritual began when I was an extremely young child because I grew up in a religious community that did certain rituals, and I was fascinated with just how those people related to it. And that fascination for me personally has continued my whole life. So much I got a whole degree in religious studies to continue studying that early in my life. But I continue to think about this too, partly because I am a therapist. I've been a therapist for 26 years. I've worked with thousands of patients, and people come to me for support when they're dealing with challenges in their lives and when they're dealing with significant transformations, the transformations of which might be challenging. And I certainly hear from people that the rituals that are already meaningful for them are highly supportive for how they cope with what's going on. In fact, some people who study religion argue that religious rituals first came about for that very reason, that humans back in the day created communal rituals that helped them individually and as a community cope with the challenges of being human. Human life is challenging. You already know this. But collectively, this is not new, and we've been devising ways to cope with the challenge of human existence ever since we could think enough to think about such a thing, right? Which goes back a very long time. So So again, why is this relevant to me and potentially relevant to you? Again, part of what I hear from my patients and my clients is that personal rituals that are either very individual to them or shared rituals that are part of their community or their religious tradition or their spiritual path, those end up being highly supportive for being able to make sense of things, to being able to cope with challenges in life, to being able to make constructive, positive change, or to have constructive adjustments to transformations that happen in life. For example, a loss and dealing with the grief process. So here's some ways that I sometimes talk with people about how they connect with rituals and some ideas to share with you, because sometimes people actually get creative in creating personal rituals that are highly constructive for helping them deal with some common issues, right? So here are three ways that rituals support us in our mental health and our general well-being. One way is that rituals are a way to reaffirm our commitment to a way of being that we value. And so, I'm making this video at the beginning of 2024. We recently had the new year. It's a time where a lot of people make New Year's resolutions, and therefore, soon after that, maybe on January 2nd for a lot of people, the question of, am I committed to whatever it was that I wanted to commit to? And if I want to be committed, but it's not easy, how do I deal with the struggle of staying oriented toward the thing and staying committed to something so that I initiate and follow through with whatever it is? Let's say someone's going to start doing yoga once a day, and so, that's going to take some will, it's going to take some focus and intention and some effort. It's going to take commitment to follow through with that plan to do that new behavior so that you can actually achieve your goal and fulfill whatever it is you value. So rituals sometimes function to help us stay oriented to and committed to something that we value. And part of the way to think about this is that rituals sometimes have these elements that invoke the thing that we value in some important way, sometimes because they kind of have meaning related to the thing that we're working with. But even if it's arbitrary, if we make the connection, the thing might work that way. And let me give you an example of something that's meaningful, right? So let's say take that goal of doing yoga once a day. So for somebody, maybe listening to some relaxing yoga type music or even like yoga chants or something that's specific to doing yoga, and that becomes not just part of their routine, but it's like a ritual. So they get up in the morning and they're having their tea and they hit play on Spotify or whatever, and they're listening to this music that they have come to associate with doing yoga. Okay. So that becomes a ritual, and the playing of the particular song or type of song ends up helping them. It supports them in bringing their focus to the activity that they've committed to and that they want to follow through with, right? Although it could be arbitrary, as I said, because let's say somebody is going to light a candle or ring a bell, or it could be anything. Click your heels together and turn around 3 times, right? If you associate an action with the thing that you want to associate it with, and then you repeat that in connection with it, you form that connection, right? So if someone wants to do yoga every morning, and for them, ringing a little gong 3 times is their ritual to kind of put them into the mental space of, now I'm oriented toward doing my yoga routine. Ringing the gong 3 times is now the thing that's associated with it, right? And it could function that way. Now, again, why do we add that? Why don't we just do our yoga? because the human brain is designed to want familiarity. It wants to have elements of rituals that get increasingly powerfully imbued with a type of energy. And I'm not getting too new age and frou-frou here when I talk about energy, but I mean the fact that something is compelling. And if you go back to my example I used a minute ago where I talked about the difference between the Catholic priest doing a traditional Easter Mass and doing Easter Mass totally through interpretive dance, why would people balk at the interpretive dance idea? Because it doesn't give that familiar, solid thing to make sense of what's happening, right? Now, in theory, a priest could enact Mass through interpretive dance, I suppose, if they wanted to get super creative with it. And they could say, yes, it's still Mass somehow. But the thing is, we humans want familiarity. We want to know that something means something, right? It's again, why do people throw rice sometimes at weddings on the heads of the newlyweds? Well, because that's been a tradition. It became associated with a certain transformation of getting married, and it becomes imbued with some energy related to the action of going from not being married to married, right? So if you get too creative with that, at some point you fall outside the thing that actually means something, and it no longer has that power, right? So instead of rice, you decide to throw other things. Well, maybe something else can be a stand-in for the rice, but at some point, throwing, a bunch of torn up pieces of paper might not be as satisfying as actually throwing bags or handfuls of rice, right? Again, does it have to be the rice? Does that element have to be in a wedding? Not really. But why is rice better than throwing torn up pieces of paper? Because the rice has become imbued with meaning, right? So, talking about instance number one, which is personal rituals that help us orient towards something that we're valuing, that we're trying to commit to. If you think about what exists in my life that actually matters to me, it could be, being a good friend. It could be being a good community member. It could be staying healthy, and part of which could be eating a healthy diet and exercising, whatever you value, right? You could just sit down with a notebook today and just brainstorm, what do I actually value? And what are the things I value, but I'm not taking a lot of action around? And what are things that I value that are emerging and not yet what I want them to be, but they're there in some form? Or what are things that I value and I am actually more developed in how I engage with it? Like volunteerism is important to me, and for 10 years, I've been showing up at this organization. Let's say it's Boy Scouts for you, and you've been helping out with the Boy Scouts. So that's a developed way of expressing a value that you have with community engagement, for example. So anyway, you could do an assessment of your values and then say, are there ways that I can bolster my engagement with the actions related to what I value through adding personal ritual, right? And again, I'm not saying let's just add personal ritual for ritual's sake. I'm just saying that sometimes rituals actually end up being highly supportive of the types of behaviors that we want to be committed to toward certain ends, right? So that's one way to think about ritual. The second way that I want to talk about ritual is when people are working with common transitions in their life that they find challenging. And I'll tell you the most common one that I end up talking with people about is people going from work to not work. So when you finish your work shift and you're leaving work and going home, or you're leaving your office if you're working at home, and then going into post-work, non-work life at home, that work to not work is a challenging transition for a lot of people. And one of the ways that that's challenging is that people find that during the workday, they might accumulate a certain amount of stress. And then they often talk to therapists like me about the fact that that stress is showing up in their home life after work, that they're carrying the work into home, or that they get fixated on work tasks and they can't sufficiently mentally unhook from worrying about, oh my God, do I need to check my email? Do I need to check my phone? Do I need to somehow just do a little more work on that project or whatever? So people have trouble unhooking from the stress of work. People have trouble unhooking from a kind of compulsion to continue being efficient and to keep working on something that's unfinished at work, right? And so that's a common transition in people I talk to. But if that's true for a person, it's also a frequent issue because they may encounter that specific issue of making that transition multiple days every week, right? So it's an ongoing issue of being able to surf that change, that transformation of now I'm at work and now I'm not at work, right? So again, with the karate class example, now I'm not at class, now I'm in class. How do we invoke that? We bow at the entrance to the practice space. For a lot of people that I've talked with who have experimented with this, going from the work state to the not work state sometimes is that transition is done much more effectively when they decide what a personal ritual is going to be in order to make that change, right? Now, sometimes there are some ways to surf that transition that are just instrumentally helpful, whether you view it as a ritual or not. If you've watched my channel, you know that one of the things that I'm a big fan of is the regular frequent practice of short bits of mindful breathing. And I do have a lot of people who use mindful breathing at the work, non-work transition, either when they're going from not working into work in the morning, let's say, at the beginning of the shift, or when they're finishing a shift and then they're going to go to the non-work state. You really get a lot of bang for your buck if you do something that has an actual effect on calming your stress system and also cognitively helps you change the channel. And mindful breathing is an excellent example of that. If you want to learn how to do mindful breathing, I'll put a link up here at the top. I've got a video and several videos on this channel where I discuss that. But check that out if you want to learn. I'll also put a link to that video in the description below if you want to watch it after you're done watching this video. But basically, sometimes we do something that actually has an actual literal effect on us to help us achieve the type of change that we want at a transition. But even if you don't do something like that, for some people, having a ritual. So let's say that I decide that I'm carrying too much work stress into my home life after work. And so I decide that when I end my work shift and I drive and I park in my driveway, before I get out of my car, I'm going to say a poem that I memorize, or I'm going to say a chant, or I'm going to count to 10, right? I pull in my driveway, I stop the car, and I say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And then I get out of my car. If I do that with the intention that the thing, in that case counting to 10, is going to become imbued with a power to help me make that transition, it will then function that way. That's the way our brains work. So, it could be arbitrary, like that example. But if we do it and we have the intention that it's going to work that way, over repetitive instances of doing that, we actually imbue it with the power to help us have the action of the change. And so that's why I say it can be arbitrary. You really can just say, what do I find convenient? What do I find desirable? What do I just want to experiment with? Okay, I'm going to choose that, and I'm going to enact it at the point where I want to make that transition. And the goal is, let's say, to let go of my work stress and to not walk in the house and get into a fight with my partner 10 minutes later, right? Because of the work stress. So I have a specific way that I want the thing to function. And just merely because we have the intention and we end up imbuing it with power through a chosen ritual or elements in a ritual or a single action, it ends up working that way, right? So you can get creative with this if you just, again, think about what are the transitions that happen regularly in my life that I don't surf as well as I would like to, and how can I play with doing something right at that transition that can function as a personal ritual to help me make that transformation, right? Like from state A to state B, like work state to post-work state, okay? So again, if you get creative with this, you can often find things that are extremely effective to have that function at those transitions, right? So the third way that sometimes I talk with people about the use of ritual for transformation has to do with more unique transformations that aren't the routine type that I was just talking about. So when I was talking about regular, like work to non-work transitions, that's one that's going to be frequent, and the ways that we deal with that might be different than if we're dealing with a very special, different, powerful, unique transition in our life. So like when people are going through the grief process because they've lost a loved one, or people are getting married, or people are dealing with a significantly changed relationship with someone they know, and they're adjusting to that change, or they've moved across the country to take a new job. You know, there are lots of transformations in life that aren't those routine ones that we're going to deal with like on a daily basis or regular basis, like I was just talking about. There's some that are extremely complex, extremely challenging, multifaceted, and those are especially difficult to deal with. And I'll just say that my general advice is if you're going through a major transition like that, not a bad idea to consider talking with a therapist, because that's part of what we do. We help people sort through challenging, complex transitions and adjustments in life. But sometimes people do use personal rituals in order to facilitate a way to constructively work with a challenging transformation or to accomplish certain types of changes or tasks within that. And so, you know, part of the reason that this can be powerful is that the ritual can help them again cognitively see themselves as going from state A to state B, which is I was the person I was before. I'm facing this big challenge, and I am in the process of becoming who I will be through and after this change. Okay, so that's the fundamental psychological task. But you know, we don't have a lot of rituals in society that do this really well. I mean, it's not that society lacks these kinds of rituals, but if you think about it, like wedding rituals are uber common, right? But how common are divorce rituals? But people separate as often as they get together almost. You know, every year in the United States, 1.2 million parents separate. Okay. So people get divorced frequently, and yet we don't have a divorce ritual that serves a similar type of function as a wedding ritual, right? Now you could argue, well, that's because our goal is to not get divorced. Sure. But that's not a reason to neglect supporting ourselves when we go through a common transition of divorce, right? Divorce is a thing. It's a common thing. And yet we don't have a divorce ritual to help people cope with that well. And as someone who's worked with thousands of people going through divorce, I actually think that's part of why people find divorce so difficult, because you're, you know, adrift in this crazy sea of confusion and challenge, and you don't have ways to make sense of it in the same way that like a wedding ritual helps bring a focus and a coherence and a way to make sense of the transition of going from not being married to married, right? So ritual functions to help make things make sense. We don't want life to be an endless like boat ride from the Willy Wonka movie, right? That's too chaotic and crazy making and stressful. We want life to make sense. And again, this is part of the appeal, I think, for a lot of people for religious practice, religious rituals, religious traditions, because religion shows up and says, hey, life is stressful, and here's some ways to make that less stressful and make it make more sense. Okay? I don't want to poo-poo religion or oversimplify what religion does and how it functions in people's lives, but I do believe that's one of the reasons that people find religion and religious rituals supportive psychologically. So sometimes somebody is going through a transition in their life, and they may be dealing with it instrumentally well, like they're moving to another part of the country and they're doing all the parts of that well. They're identifying where to live, they put a lease on a new apartment, they get a moving company to move their stuff. So they're doing all the nitty-gritty that needs to happen. But psychologically, they may be really struggling with the adjustment. And so sometimes personal ritual is a way to make those adjustments. Let me give you kind of what might seem like a little bit of a crazy example. That I knew a story about someone once where they were getting divorced, and they decided that they wanted to personally embody that transition, to cope with that transition. And just like when you get married, you have your friends and family come witness that transition. This person in the story actually called up their friends and said, hey, meet me at this certain location on a certain day because I'm going to do a personal divorce ritual. Now, they weren't doing this with their divorcing partner, I don't think, but they showed up and their friends showed up, and they came up with just a bunch of arbitrary things, right? So they rang a bell, they did a little dance, whatever it was they did certain elements that they had just personally said, this makes sense to me and I'm going to include it, and this is going to be my creative divorce ritual, and I'm going to do this with my friends, and it's going to represent me making this transition into being divorced. Okay. So, that's something that someone did for an ad hoc, unique transition in their life in order to make that transition. Or I've had a lot of people who they were having to let go of something, either somebody they lost or a relationship that changed a lot, or something they were really attached to, like living in a certain city, but there are reasons that they moved, or whatever it happens to be. I've had people where they really had trouble letting go of the former thing, and it had a lot of power that was challenging for them in some ways, because they knew that they needed to kind of move on from whatever it was, but they really had trouble letting it go. And for some people, having a personal ritual ends up being facilitative of that transition to move on. It may not be like the end-all finishing of the transition, but it ends up being very supportive for helping them psychologically adjust to a new identity that is them after that change. And so for some people, let's say that's lighting a candle every day for a month. For some people, that's creating a little paper boat that represents the thing they want to let go of and going and putting it in a river and watching it sail on down the river away from them. For some people, it's a visualization. I'm imagining all of the parts of this that I need to let go of, and I'm putting them in an imaginary canoe on an imaginary lake, and I'm pushing the canoe off and watching the canoe drift off, and it gets so far away that I eventually can't see it. Or like I'm going to light a candle attached to one of those candle balloon things that you can get. By the way, those are really cool, and I'll put a link in the description for those. You want to go check those out. Those are really wild. But, I live in Thailand part of the time, and there's this annual ritual where they take these paper lantern things that have lights in them, and it's a shared societal ritual that represents, a renewal. And so they light these lights and they all fly up in the sky, and it's really pretty. But you could do that yourself. You don't have to live in Thailand. You don't have to be a Thai and personally relate to that particular ritual that way. You could just get one of those lanterns, and it could represent the thing that you want to have be in transition for you in constructive ways. And you could go somewhere and safely light that lantern and let it float off into the sky. And that could be your ritual of lighting that paper lantern, right? So sometimes a personal transformation where you are on, where the rubber meets the road on the mundane level, you are taking care of what needs to be taken care of, and yet you're finding it psychologically challenging to make the more long-term adjustment to whatever that transformation is. Sometimes playing with personal ritual is a way to facilitate that adjustment, right? So again, if you want help being creative about that type of thing, even a therapist who isn't as crazy as me and thinks about this particular thing all the time probably would help you craft a personal ritual that is meaningful to the type of transformation that you actually want to enact, right? So just a thought. You could also go Google personal ritual, and I bet there's lots of discussion on the internet about the topic. I haven't done that. I'm certain it exists, right? There may be books on the topic, right? And if I find a book that's on the topic after I publish this video, I'll put that link down in the description as well. By the way, a couple of things. One, if I put links in the description, sometimes they are to my own resources. Sometimes they're affiliate links. If you follow those, you end up buying something on an affiliate link. It doesn't cost you anymore, but it ends up supporting me and the channel. But also, I'll add here, if you're liking this kind of content, please hit the like button. And if you have comments about it, please comment below. And if you have yet to subscribe to the channel, please subscribe. So anyway, I just want to share this because it's something that's come up with my clients many, many times over the 26 years I've been in practice so far. And I find that when people work with personal rituals, or people find constructive ways to plug into conventional or traditional rituals, let's say in their religious tradition, if they're religious and connected to a particular tradition, I think those are very psychologically supportive. That is the point of this video. And yet, even if you're not connected to a tradition that provides that for you already, in a handy way, you can create them yourself, which is the point of this video. Like, you really can come up with things that are personally meaningful, elements of rituals for you that you can imbue with the power to do the things that you want them to do. And if you experiment with this, you're likely to find that it's supportive of you, of making the kinds of transitions that you want to make in your life. The first type, commitment, you could call it commitment. The second type, routine transitions that you find challenging. And the third type, major transitions in life that are also often complex and considerably challenging for all of us. So I know you got a lot to do with your time. I sincerely appreciate you joining me on this channel, and stay tuned, subscribe, and I will keep making videos on a wide range of wellness topics. Thanks.